Hello everybody, we are back and today we are doing Fire and Brimstone and American sex hippies in the woods and a whole bunch of other stuff. Basically, we are looking at what is the deep American religion. A question that I think Camille Paglia in her work really sets out to try and answer. And to do this, we're continuing reading through her paper on cults and cosmic consciousness and the forgotten legacy of the 1960s. We started looking at that last time in the previous video, which looks like this. If my slide is going to work. This video. So perhaps you've seen it, perhaps you haven't. I would advise going back and watching that one if you haven't seen it already. It's a good one, and thanks for everybody who wrote in the comments. There was some good stuff. A few people who are pissed off and think that Camille Paglia has nothing of interest to say. You guys are wrong. Go and read her, seriously. So, as I mentioned, Fire and Brimstones, the radical Protestants of America. And we're continuing, if you're new here, by reading through some of the most important passages from this paper, which you will be able to find in the comments. In the description, rather. In the Great Awakening of the mid-18th century, the Congregational minister Jonathan Edwards lit up the Connecticut Valley with his call for a renewal of Calvinist belief. So this would be the 1740s, 50s. Edwards viewed the ease and slackness of contemporary religious practice as a falling off from the disciplined vigour of New England's Puritan forefathers. His terrifying 1741 fire sermon, or sinners in the hands of an angry God, stressed man's contemptible weakness. But the 1960s spiritual awakening, as a program of rebellious liberalization, more resembled Transcendentalism from 1835 to 1860, early to mid-19th century, which was influenced by British Romanticism and German idealism. Its leading figure, Ralph Waldo Emerson, had been a Unitarian minister, descended from a line of clinics, but resigned his post because he could not accept the doctrine of transubstantiation in the Eucharist. That's whether or not Jesus Christ is truly there in the flesh and blood. More generally, Emerson was repelled by the passionless and rote formulas of genteel church-going. His suave father, a Boston minister, had the social success that Emerson spurned. So, what she's pointing to here are two currents within the last, say, 250 years of American religious, it's not just thought, it's religious experience. And I think that's important because it's not just so much metaphysics and dogma and theology as real experiences that gathered communion were having, that poets were having, that visionaries were having. Mr. Jonathan Edwards, if we look at some of the quotes from his speeches, the God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. As I said, fire and brimstone, visions of hell, this radical Protestant Puritan drawing on this very powerful and vengeful Yahweh from the Old Testament, that you are unworthy of God and you should cower in his light. Something like a spider. Hell is gaping for them. The flames gather and flash about them, and would prefer to lay hold of them and swallow them up. The fire pent up in their own hearts is struggling to break out. They have no interest in any mediator. They are no means within reach that can be any security to them. In short, they have no refuge, nothing to take hold of. All that preserves them every moment is the sovereign, all-powerful will, the uncovenanted, unobliged forbearance of an incensed God. Again, you see the radical Protestant thrust there, where there's almost that there is nothing to you cannot plead or bargain or tally up with God. Now, I'm not sure actually whether Jonathan Edwards was part of the radical predestinationists. My sense would be yes. But you might want to check that for yourself. Meaning the people, the radical Protestants who said your salvation is preordained from the moment that you are born. So there is no way that you can bargain, you can find your way with God. That, okay, yes, you pray and you go to church, but it's more an expression of your faith than an attempt to raise you up to some kind of divine consciousness. And this is an important subtle difference, especially when considering how many occult and esoteric paths, Eastern and Western, tend to see their practice of raising the human to meet the divine, as if it's like a friendly meeting. But there can be something in this radical Puritan Protestant lineage that says, no, that's self-delusion. In fact, that is sinful to imagine that you can raise yourself to God. Now, as I said, unfortunately, I don't actually know whether Jonathan Edwards is part of that tradition. I think he probably is. And these are deep currents to be aware of, because they stand very differently to the more yogic traditions that have become more popular with the importing of Eastern ideas and Hinduism and Buddhism and even other Western esoteric traditions. We also mentioned, and we'll go into this in the next slide, this other strain, this more transcendentalist strain, which is much more influenced by European romanticism and nature worship. Certainly this Emerson picture and framing and this cover here. If you remember the video we did on accelerationism and vampires, those of you who were there, we were looking at English romanticism and poetry and Wordsworth versus Coleridge. And in the way there's almost two strains that go through romanticism. There is the beautiful Arcadian romanticism, beautiful trees and sunsets and grass and all the rest of it. And there's the more demonic or vampiric romanticism that also sees the viciousness and the violence and the amorality of nature that is sometimes repressed. I think one other thing to notice just before we move on is that actually, although the Protestant Puritan imaginary in some sense tries to strip itself back to basics, to remove unnecessary ritual and ceremony and practice and blah blah blah, just look at the potency of the language that Edwards is using and the types of images that are being inspired and associated with it. It's violent, it's heavy metal in a sense, and this obsession with hell and blazing punishment is something that is very, very much part of this deep radical Christianity. Here's a couple more images of this. What was it? The Great Awakening in the 18th century. Preachers standing up in these in their villages and connecting people. It was a time of religious fervor. I actually noticed while I was researching for this video as well, there's a film coming up based on another of these radical Great Awakening preachers, Mr. George Whitefield. Now, I don't know if this film is any good. I've not seen it. It looks like they've spent quite a bit of money on it. It stands out from your usual run-of-the-mill Hollywood type movie making. This is a movie about worshippers of Christ. And what does it say here? One of Whitefield's closest friends becomes none other than Benjamin Franklin. True liberty cannot only be written into law, it must be awakened in the hearts of the people. I think it's interesting that this movie is being made now, not only 250 years perhaps, but this living through a time of religious revival and a renewed turn towards Christianity. There's something perhaps awakening in the 2020s, as there was in the 1960s, as there was also perhaps in the 1740s and 50s. Deep patterns, deep cycles. We're not just looking at the last decade or so. But now to our transcendentalists, our hippies in the woods. Emerson, who we've already mentioned, was reserved and austere, not unlike the romantic poet William Wordsworth, who had a similar reverence for nature. Emerson transferred his family's religious vocation to the romantic cult of nature, a pagan pantheism. His holistic vision of nature like that of his friend Henry David Thoreau, prefigures 1960s ecology. There we go. Indeed, Thoreau's Walden, 1854, a journal of his experiment in monastic living in the woods near Boston, became a canonical text for the 60s counterculture. The most intriguing of the parallels between New England Transcendentalism and the 1960s thought is Emerson's interest in Asian literature, mainly Hindu sacred texts, the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, and Confucius's maxims. India's religious literature had been unknown to the West until the first European translation of the Bhagavad Gita appeared in 1785, when Sanskrit studies had just begun. The titles Emerson gave to his poems Brahma and Maya were inexplicable to most readers at the time. Brahma is the Hindu creator god. Maya is the veil of illusion. Brahma, first published in 1857, was the butt of so many satirical lampoons that Emerson's publisher begged him to no avail to drop it from the 1876 edition of his selected poems. In his seminal essays, 1836-41, Emerson refers to God as the Oversoul, a translation of the Sanskrit word Atman, meaning supreme and universal soul. Emerson's Oversoul would be reinterpreted by Friedrich Nietzsche as the Übermensch, which translators often misleadingly render in English as Superman. Now, this is intriguing. This is Paglia attempting to put her finger on the first import of Indian cosmology and mythology into the West. And it's not the 1960s. It's not even Aleister Crowley and his friends doing yoga in the 1920s. It's practically a century before then, with these Sanskrit studies opening and scholars starting to read these texts, and then poets, importantly, poets in the 1840s, or 1850s rather, tapping into what's going on there and starting to see the world in a way inspired not merely perhaps by Christianity and Judaism, but also by a more pantheistic, a more polytheistic religiosity. And I found this point about the Oversoul and the Übermensch fascinating. Right? If that link is indeed the way, it is interesting that Nietzsche may have taken his famous idea as an inspiration by Hindu cosmology, rather than this more, you might say, Faustian idea of a man, an individual man who constantly overcomes himself. More an idea of a spirit that lives beyond him and beyond all of us. We can read just from that poem Brahma here. If the red slayer think he slays, or if the slain think he is slain, they know not well the subtle ways I keep and pass and turn again. Far or forgot to me is near, shadow and sunlight are the same. The vanished gods to me appear, and one to me are shame and fame. Very non-dualistic perspective. They reckon ill who leave me out. When they fly, I am the wings. I am the doubter and the doubt, and I the hymn the Brahmin sings. The strong gods pine for my abode, and pine in vain the sacred seven. But thou, meek lover of the good, find me and turn thy back on heaven. Remember, this is a poem from America in 1957, not an Indian poem at all. And on the right here, we've got a picture of the Beatles when they had their moment in India. Now, just a total aside, if you've been enjoying these videos and are interested in the work that Dark Renaissance are doing, we are now available via our website to have conversations and work with you if you've got interesting projects, art projects, or events, or businesses that you'd like some creative advice or workshopping with. Give me a message, give me and Raven a message, and we can have a conversation and work if we can work out something, an interesting way of working together. back to our thread here. Here's some more of these images and poetry of the Transcendentalism. So here's a famous, actually, I think it's a sculpture, or rather, I don't know what the word for it is. It's Thoreau in the woods, carved in wood. That's what it is. Thoreau in the woods, carved of wood. He'd probably like that. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. Thoreau in the woods, carved of wood. Notice this very Arcadian imagery. Arcadia, traditionally meaning the mythical landscape of archaic Greece, where these poems were written about woods, nymphs, satyrs, shepherds, an imaginary that gets picked up in Romanticism, not just European Romanticism as we see, but this American Romanticism. And these two paintings are of landscapes taken not from Europe, but from America. There's a little quote here that I just pulled from a website on Transcendentalism. So the movement completely redefined the relationships between nature and man. Transcendentalism emphasized the importance of the individual and, unlike the earlier Romanticism, developed in America during the 1830s to 40s. In addition, Transcendentalism had an added component of religiosity. Believing in an oversoul, Transcendentalists thought that there was a vital universal force made up of all souls. This force was believed to transcend individual consciousness. Not only did Transcendentalists appreciate nature, but they also thought that nature and self-consciousness connected humans to God. While the movement was mainly in the literary realm, the same ideas extended into the art of the era. Nature, God, spirituality, oversoul, vital current moving through all souls, transcending the individual consciousness. Again, a religious thrust, but very, very different to the Puritan lineage upon which America had been founded. More pantheistic, possibly more pagan, although we don't see these pagan deities yet so much. It is the woods and the stones and the mountains and the animals. It's going out west even, or going up north, going to the mountains and maybe never coming back. That was Thoreau, going out there and not coming back. Of course, there is still something perhaps deeply American in this going towards the wilderness. The people who had gone west across the ocean and then continued to go west, seeking to get away from the over-constrained, overly coded, you could say, world of Europe and its hierarchies, towards something that perhaps felt a bit more primitive and a bit more free. I mention that because it's interesting, of course, to not just read, for example, our Puritan Protestant strain and our Transcendentalist strain as opposing forces, but as two elements of the same spiritual movement somehow. This was a nice painting as well, just because it's got that Arcadian imagery, but then also in the clouds it has something that looks relatively like a Hindu temple. I thought that captured this meeting of a very European style of painting with a more Hindu or Eastern style of religious experience. Now we move on to Mr. Walt Whitman, another of these transcendentalists, and there's some fun in this slide. So in his Leaves of Grass from 1855, Walt Whitman absorbed British Romantic poetry as well as Emerson's poems and essays with their disparate Asian influences. Whitman's sprawling pagan epic expanded over succeeding decades, openly challenged Judeo-Christianity. So that's interesting, he's going for it now explicitly. After William Blake's allegorical long poems, Leaves of Grass is Western literature's closest approximation to the dynamic form and visionary style of Hindu sacred literature with its cosmic scale. Whitman's poem would have tremendous influence on the 1960s via 50s beat poetry. In particular, Allen Ginsberg's prophetic protest poem Howl from 1956, which imitates Whitman's long incantatory lines. Ginsberg regularly paid homage to Whitman, as in his amusing 1955 poem A Supermarket in California, which addresses Whitman by name. That's an important link she's drawing there, that actually Whitman and the Transcendentalists went directly to the beats who inspired the 60s in turn. There is a lineage here. In other words, this vision continues. The limitations in Emersonian Transcendentalism are suggested by the reservations expressed by both Emerson and Thoreau to the sexual material in Leaves of Grass by Whitman, which, despite their great admiration for the poem, they felt to be crude flaws. In other words, now we see a tension between some of the Transcendentalists. They think that Whitman, in a sense, goes too far. Emerson, who had always disliked the bawdiness in Shakespeare's plays, actually advised Whitman to purge sexual references from later editions of Leaves of Grass. In this respect, the romantic nature cult of Emerson and Thoreau betrays their Puritan lineage. Like I mentioned, actually, two sides of the same movement. They see nature in clean, rigorous terms, but cannot tolerate or encompass nature's stormier energies, the theme of Herman Melville's Moby Dick from 1851. Another great work of American literature. Significantly, though he enjoyed choosing hymns for Sunday services, Emerson did not much care for music. Despite the call for ecstasy in his poem Bacchus, he was evidently made uncomfortable by music's heady rhythms and emotional stimulation. It was the American 1960s that would complete Transcendentalism through the new barbaric medium of rock. Remember that, we're going to come back to that in a slide or two's time. Point here being, again, that Emerson had a problem with where Whitman went. Perhaps Whitman was the real radical who, as Paglia suggests, was the precursor of the 1950s and 60s. So here's a little bit of Whitman. To him that was crucified, remember her saying that he speaks directly to the Christian lineage. My spirit to yours, dear brothers, do not mind because many sounding your name do not understand you. I do not sound your name, but I understand you. There are others also. I specify you with joy, O my comrade, to salute you and to salute those who are with you before and since, and those to come also. And it goes on, but we won't read all of it. Just note the way he's speaking to Jesus directly while also attacking his followers and believers in the church, saying they do not understand you. He, by contrast, is saying, I don't sing your name, which I take to mean I'm not an active worshipper in any traditional sense, but I understand you as a teacher, as a lover of man, as a poet, as a visionary. It's a much more personal kind of spirituality rather than an institutional one. Very different also to the fiery, the brimstone visions we saw just a few slides ago that were saying you have nothing to cling on to. There is nothing to hang on to. There is no covenant really to find. They're uncovenanted. This is personal. This is intimate relationship with God. Much more, again, speaking of the Indian influence, much more of a bhakti yoga, if you know this term. That's sort of personal devotional practice. That's what he's expressing, I think. Another line, O you whom I often and silently come. O you whom I often and silently come where you are, that I may be with you. As I walk by your side or sit near or remain in the same room with you, little you know the subtle electric fire that for your sake is playing within me. Now here, he seems to be nodding to, again, something that in Indian or Tantric Buddhist knowledge is often discussed about, subtle body, subtle electricity, often evoked via erotic practice, sexual practice. This is interesting. This is 1850s America discussing what we might call today tantric ideas and practices. And now we have the most extreme. You can definitely see how this might have upset some of the Puritans. This is the female form. A divine nimbus exhales from it head to foot. It attracts with fierce, undeniable attraction. I am drawn by its breath as if I were no more than a helpless vapour. All falls aside but myself and it. Books, art, religion, time, the visible and solid earth, and what was expected of heaven or feared of hell, are now consumed. Mad filaments, ungovernable shoots play out of it, the response likewise ungovernable. Hair, bosom, hips, bend of legs, negligent falling hands, all diffused, mine too diffused, ebb stung by the flow and flow by the ebb, love flesh swelling and deliciously aching, limitless limpid jets of hot love, an enormous quivering jelly of love, white blow and delirious juice, bridegroom night of love working surely and softly into the prostrate dawn, undulating into the willing and yielding day, lost in the cleave of the clasping and sweet-fleshed day. The whole poem is called I Sing the Body Electric, Walt Whitman. It's a lot longer than that. It's worth reading. And as I mentioned, many of this does seem to nod, whether intentionally or not, to these tantric physiologies of energies and flows moving through the body. Now back to the point about music and how Paglia thinks that actually it was that thrust that came through in Whitman was then picked up and found its way into the rock music of the 60s. A main aperture through which Hinduism flowed into the 60s was popular music, which adapted the non-Western harmonics of raga and experimented with the sitar, the long-necked Indian lute. George Harrison, the Beatles' lead guitarist, was not the first British musician to experiment with the sitar, but he deserves the principal credit for popularising it in Anglo-American rock music. Jangling sitar riffs were a ubiquitous lyrical motif in late 60s music. At the opening of songs, the sitar was equivalent in meaning and effect to the European church bell, summoning the faithful to worship. Maybe you can think of some 60s classics that have this twangy sound, or these shredding lead guitar tones that pick up some of that sound as well. What I've included down here for interest, so hey, there's some pictures again of the Beatles with their Indian guru. There's also the place now known just as the Beatles ashram, which is in Rishikesh in India, which is where they lived and studied in the late 60s. And it, for whatever reason, went out of business. I think it was the late 1980s where it went out of business. And the land is still there. It's not been bought and developed. I was there in 2016, and you're able to go and walk around this ashram that's somewhere out in the jungle and being somewhat eaten by the jungle again. It's fascinating. You've got these beautiful artworks in homage to what was happening there 60 years ago with dirt and trees growing over them. I assume it must be protected in some sense as a cultural site, but without money to turn it into a serious theme park or anything, which is actually really, really interesting because it means it has this decadent sort of half gone feel to it. There's an entrance that you're supposed to pay to get through, but it was easy for me to just go around and climb in the back without paying. There was no fence. So interesting. It's worth, if you find yourself in India, in Rishikesh, go check out the Beatles ashram. It's quite a potent place. Paglia goes on. In addition to the sitar or an electric guitar strung and played to sound like one, like we said, the style of acid rock that originated in the San Francisco hippie scene can arguably be considered to have religious intonations. Acid rock helped promulgate the 60s concept of cosmic consciousness. Even those like me, who did not take drugs, were radicalized by the power and expansiveness of that shimmering music. With its unfixed keys, sonic distortions, ominous drone, wandering melodic lines, and twangy, floating, evaporating notes. The way she writes is so fantastic. She really captures something of that, and that's very core to Paglia's way of writing. She believes that criticism should be a work of art in itself. Really important. She writes as a voice of the 60s. In fact, in one of her interviews, she says, I think I'm the first, I can't remember if she calls herself philosopher or writer. I'm the first writer to write with the voice of rock. I am a lead guitarist, but I use words rather than the guitar. That's explicitly how she describes herself. The leading San Francisco acid rock bands were Jefferson Airplane, The Grateful Dead, Quicksilver Messenger Service, and Big Brother and the Holding Company. Psychedelic effects were used in LA by the Byrds and the Doors, and in England by the Yardbirds, Jeff Beck, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Donovan, the Kinks, and early Pink Floyd. The drugged music of this trippy style was revived in British trance music called trip-hop in the early 90s as a development of the rave scene. Because it consists of transient instrumental effects, psychedelic music has received far less attention than folk and folk rock with overtly political lyrics, whose manifest content is easier to analyse. This is yet another factor impeding the general recognition of the 60s religious legacy. This is important, and this gets into things that we've discussed in several of the previous videos, that our Western art and cultural education has been largely based in philosophy coming from postmodern French criticism and, to a certain extent, Marxist criticism as well, which comes from Hegel, which is all concept first. This obsessive, neurotic fixation on concepts and words and language, and actually, in many intellectuals, a complete inability to grasp the meaning of anything like dance or sound or fashion or colour or sculpture or food or light. All of these things that, of course, make up a work of art are relegated to some kind of transient secondary effect relative to explicit political or social or sexual relational content. And if that's one thing that perhaps I think I'm driving home through these videos, and that I think picking up from Paglia and driving home, is that we've got to broaden the understanding of what art, ritual, ceremony is beyond obsessive conceptuality, which of course is there in the best art, but often overlooked. And for some reason, I mean, you can see it with the popularity of sort of trashy pop and hip hop. Hip hop, okay, it's got great moments, but again, it's all words. It's often poetic and well executed, but the music, the soundscape itself is relegated to something that simply supports the spoken word. And then our trashy pop music, the less said, the better. The sculpting of sonic and visual worlds, different worlds, not worlds that in some sense attempt to criticize and improve our one, but that radically envision altered states of consciousness, you could say. That was there in the 60s and in other religious moments. It's not so much present with us at the moment. Since you mentioned trip-hop, I think I'd just do a little aside. It's from just a standard search for trip-hop. Trip-hop is an atmospheric, down-tempo genre that emerged from Bristol, UK in the early 1990s, blending slow hip-hop beats with electronic soul, funk and dub influences. Often called the Bristol sound, it features cinematic, melancholic and often bass-heavy textures. Key pioneers include Massive Attack, Portishead and Tricky, who define the genre. I studied in Bristol. Bottom left is a nightclub called Lakota. I spent a lot of time there. And on the right is a picture of me when I was in India, 21 years old, doing the whole hippie trail. I include this just as a nod to the fact that in some sense I didn't know what I was dealing with back then at all. It was good parties. But these lineages of things that I've been thinking about and exploring for a long time, and seeing them weaving together in interesting in ways and important ways, I think matters. Moving on. The gap in the 60s artistic and intellectual legacy partly occurred because too many young people followed their elementary understanding of Asian religion by making sensory experience primary. So now Paglia is putting forward her critique of the naivety of that decade. Shunning schedules and routine, they sought the eternal now dramatized by the otherworldliness of psychedelic rock. Furthermore, the sexual revolution, which began in 1960 with the commercial release of Enovit, the first reliable oral contraceptive in history, finally overwhelmed the 60s spiritual quest. Beat interpretations of Asian thought tended to exaggerate its sexual component. In 1958, Alan Watts criticized Beat Zen for its anything-goes attitude towards sex. Similarly, hipsters often carelessly reduced Hinduism to the erotic acrobatics of Tantric Yoga, or the Kama Sutra from 250 AD. But sexual codes have been very strict throughout India's history. At no time was promiscuity endorsed. The yoni and lingam, monumental stone genitalia in Hindu shrines, or the voluptuous copulating couples on the facade of Hindu temples, belonged to a fertility cult where sexual intercourse symbolized the natural cycle of birth and death. What she's nodding to here is the way in that, yes, Eastern religion, Zen, Tantra, Vajrayana, Hinduism, one can find replete, vivid sexual imagery and indeed practices, highly specialized and well cultivated practices for working with sexuality and energy. However, the way these have been taken up in the West, 1950s and 60s and onwards, has been somewhat careless and reflective of our consumeristic orientation, turning it towards personal pleasure and, you could perhaps say, inflation of one's ego rather than connection with the transcendental other world. We spoke about this a little bit in the previous video about the shift in the 1960s from cosmic consciousness and acid and marijuana to the 1970s and the ubiquity of cocaine, a drug that is much more self-oriented. And we can see down here these images variously of ancient tantric carvings and then more modern tantric sex, or tantric sex communities and communes, which we see down here on the right is a bunch of attractive looking rich white people. Nothing wrong with that, but there is something, that image is corny. Everybody looks at that image and think that image is corny. It's cringe, it's weird in some way. And it's a bit make-believe. And that's not to say that these communities aren't doing, in some senses, good work. I wouldn't go that far. I know people who are involved in the Tantra world and who get a lot out of it. I've gotten a lot myself out of certain practices. But I think the thing is to remember that just sex and pleasure is not spirituality in itself. I once had a yoga teacher who said, don't force yourself to touch your toes. It's not going to make you enlightened. You might say also, all the sex in the world is not going to make you enlightened. There are other aspects to the path. And for whatever reason, we seem to have elevated pleasure and sexual empowerment to one of the highest ethical ideals. And for what? It's not made many people enlightened. She goes on, free love was never achieved on a massive scale until the 1960s, when random sexual connection was blithely assigned a spiritual and redemptive meaning. Getting it on meant freeing mind and body to strike a blow against residual American Puritanism. So that's interesting. She's pointing to the implicit political message or act behind so-called sexual freedom. By the hedonistic 70s, spirituality had been abandoned, a change marked by the shift in drugs from communal mellow marijuana and LSD to edgy, expensive, hoarded cocaine. There we go, we mentioned that, which sharpened competition, enhanced the ego sense of power and mastery. And, of course, makes networks of Albanian and Mexican drug dealers and Colombian very, very, very rich, and brutalizes the people who live in those countries. Sexual liberation, as should now be obvious, had its high costs, which we are still sorting out. Sexual diseases, a soaring divorce rate, and a pandemic sexualization of media images with uncertain consequences for children. Remember, this article was written 20 years ago or so. The pandemic of sexualization of media images has gotten a whole lot more intense. Self-presentation by early teens, for example, has becoming strikingly eroticized, leading to premature sexual pressures and demands. I might say self-preservation has also led to premature sexual pressures and demands. One of the things I just thought funny was this ethos of this guy up here in the top right from the 60s, make love not money, flower power and all that. This is a video down in the bottom left. Sexual wealth, how to manifest money using orgasmic energy. A recent video. Now, in defense, I've not followed this channel at all, but it actually looks like it might be quite an interesting video. The occult traditions do have teachings around using sexual magnetism, sexual energy to attract all sorts of things, including wealth and opportunity. Sure. But it's fascinating to see this flip over 60 years from using love and sex to reject the hierarchies of money and business in favor of a supposedly better world, as opposed to the more modern sensibility of using the same practice and ethos for self-improvement and growth and enhancement. You know, one of the things I always laugh about, I saw a woman on Instagram once who had super duper new age and beads and hippies and blonde, beautiful, gorgeous woman. And the tagline is like erotic awakening for 6 and 7 figure women. 6 and 7 figures in £600,000, £6 million, whatever you go. There you go, right? Hippies for rich entrepreneurs. That's in some sense where we're at now. Paglia goes on. Feeling trapped by a corporate and technological society, 60s rebels tried to empower sex as a quick route to reconnection with nature. The 60s dreamed of limitless sex without consequence, a bouncy, open-ended Technicolor film with a rock soundtrack. Many genuine hippies dropped out of college to join communes, bake bread, and have babies. Others of the 60s generation who entered the professions often defied or delayed the procreative principle that was at the heart of ancient mystery cult. This is important. Some of the perhaps unintended effects of the sexual revolution, or perhaps intended effects, but ways in which actually it leaves behind that sacred mystery cult of procreation. 2 new models of sexual liberation emerged in the 70s. The liberated woman who put career before marriage and family, and the post-Stonewall gay man in whose paradise of pleasure even low lesbians were no longer welcome. Top right, we've got the classic boss girl. You can do what you like, girl. You don't need no man. And you can fuck whoever you want. And you don't have kids. Maybe you have kids once you're rich enough. Or IVF them. Or get a surrogate mother so you can continue working, right? Reproductive rights, establishing women's control over their own bodies, was always a major issue in feminism, but over the next quarter century would become an obsessive preoccupation, determining campaign politics and judicial appointments. Feminism inextricably identified itself with abortion, with termination of life rather than fertility. I am speaking, Paglia is speaking, as a militantly pro-choice feminist. Feminism's foregrounding of abortion, which caused national turmoil and limited its outreach as a populist movement, was one consequence of the loss of 60s cosmic consciousness by the 70s. Now, this is a big, bold claim. But if she's right, it really helps to historicize the whole thing around abortion and why it's become such a divisive and potent issue, especially in the in the USA. We seem to be a bit cooler of it in Europe, although there does seem to be some apparent trend towards abortion skepticism along the traditionalist right. I find Paglia's position here really interesting. She doesn't say it so explicitly here, but she said in other interviews that, yes, I'm militantly pro-choice, but I'm intensely critical of the Democrats and especially the liberal atheists who frame this as a question of women's rights or women's control over their bodies. It is a religious question, one way or another. And the conservatives who are opposed to abortion are not misogynists, they're not patriarchs, they're not hateful in any sense. They actually see the cosmos in a divine, mythological, religious way. And abortion is a massive ethical transgression. It's taking the life of one of God's most innocent creations. And until liberals and the supposedly progressive left can begin to wrap their head around the seismic nature of what that means for religious people and develop a way of thinking and addressing this issue that looks at it as a matter of one of the most primordial ritual deep cults that exists, it will get nowhere, and it will continue to be a source of friction and resentment. As for the gays, well, free love detached from all reference to nature meant that by the 80s their ruling theorist would be the social constructionist Michel Foucault rather than the nature-revering Whitman or Ginsberg. It's interesting that mention to them. Ginsberg was gay, I think. Whitman seems to have been bisexual. Certainly if you judge by the poetry that we read earlier, which is very much loving a woman's body and getting cummed all over. Although maybe that's his own fantasy. Despite a 70s fad for the virile lumberjack look, the erotic ideal in the gay male world has reverted over time to the ruthless master type of the Greek beautiful boy, Antinous reborn, the shaved, sculpted Callipygian ephebe whose perfection is heartbreakingly transient. And there's Foucault and Antinous on the bottom right. Antinous being, if I remember correctly, the young boy lover taken by the Emperor Hadrian, who died at a very, very young age. In the middle and on the left, by contrast, we have Whitman, Ginsberg, Whitman in the middle, Ginsberg on the right, and the classic gay gumberjack, the gay gumberjack look on the left. Where our gays are at today seems to be, on the most part, a development still of the beautiful boy look, but perhaps even less phallic in some regard. Foucault died of AIDS. Alexander Bard has often made the point, somewhat jokingly, but somewhat seriously, that lots of the best gays died of AIDS, and we were left with basically the ones who didn't fuck. And then the next generation of gays, the millennial gays, the gays of the 2000s and 2010s, were raised, their ideals in popular culture and academia were the unfucked, resentful gays who didn't die of AIDS. And so we've ended up with a peculiarly weak and nasty form of male homosexuality. The LGBTQ plus thing. I mean, you've also got, in a sense, this has always often been one of the critiques by the gay community of actually what's happened in the transgender world, that transgenderism is teaching young gay men to neuter themselves and to think that they are in fact women born in the wrong body, then being heroic gay men. It's an interesting tension that's been going on, a conversation that's been bubbling under the surface. And certainly there is something powerful and potent to a certain gay archetype. Probably the most obvious example being Mr. Peter Thiel of the PayPal mafia. That is not an effeminate, flowery pansy. That is a technological world builder, right? One of the most rich and powerful men on the planet. Very, very classical in that sense. The massive drug taking in the 60s, promoted by arts leaders and pop stars, redefined the culture and set the stage for the decade's religious vision. But shamanistic drug taking in tribal societies took place within small communities unified by a coherent belief system. Hippies and college students casually sampling hallucinogens were relative strangers and brought with them a melange of private turmoils and family psychodramas. What they shared was a yearning humanitarianism and rock music which urged the liberation of sexual desire. Sex was portrayed as a revolutionary agent. The establishment, like the walls of Jericho, would fall before Eros unbound. This overestimation of sex, the faith that sexual energy freed of social controls is inherently benign, was one reason for the dissipation of the authentic spiritual discoveries made by the 60s generation. A philosophy of random contacts and good vibrations built little that could be passed on to the next generation. At its mildest, the 60s cult of sex and drugs led to a frivolous dilettantism, youthful hijinks like the Florida spring flings of the 50s. At its worst, however, there was permanent damage that has never been systematically assessed. In retrospect, it is clear, for example, that the meteoric literary careers of Allen Ginsberg and Ken Kesey were sadly truncated by drug abuse. This is Paglia again saying the 60s, with its naive approach to sexual liberation and drugs, failed to achieve, to manifest much of what it thought it was about. It had a vision, perhaps it had a very authentic, real vision, rooted in an explosion of some kind of spirituality, synthesizing from the East and the West. But naivety, arrogance, perhaps even in the case of America being a relatively young people relative to Europe, just youthfulness. There's something youthful, there's something kind of teenage about the 1960s, you could say. The sense that we could just have it all and have no trouble. Teenage rebellion, the archetype of the teenager is very, very 1960s. Something in that let it down. And the last 60 years have been dealing with the flack, either rejecting or trying to take parts of it, whether it's the progressive politics or the liberal social values, but without the transcendental vision that actually inspired it. That has gone over, or rather been held by the religious and the traditionalists. And of course, a little on the right hand side, a picture of looks like Mick Jagger in a bath with two beautiful young women. And on the right, an unheard piece about acid casualties, one of the best terms to define or describe what happens to people who take too many psychedelics and burn their minds out. While the political sentiments of young people at such events were progressive, talking about the 1960s festivals and up the Bacchanalia, there was often little understanding of the slow process and banal practicalities of legislation, administration, and financial accounting. Repelled by the expanding bureaucracies of the 50s, the 60s counterculture was suspicious of hierarchy and embraced a simplistic egalitarianism predicated on quick fixes. The basic principle of the counterculture began as communality, but ended as a horde, the most primitive entity in social history. The horde is prey to superstition and panic. It looks for leaders, but ruthlessly slays them and reveres them as ancestral spirits. As a survival response to its own flood of anarchic energies, the horde automatically generates cults and cultic belief. The 60s horde that was a benign extended family of music-loving stargazers at the Woodstock Music Festival in August 1969 turned into a restless, bickering mob 4 months later at the Altamont Festival, where a murder was committed in front of the stage. The 60s never completed its search for new structures of social affiliation. 50s liberalism was integrationist, but 60s leftism, despite its claims of inclusiveness, disintegrated into the separatism of identity politics, with ghettoizing reclassifications and hypersensitive divisions by race, gender, and sexual orientation. The 60s code of do your own thing encouraged individualism, but produced fragmentation. Similarly, the 60s global religious vision, inspired by fleeting contact with Hinduism and Buddhism, would broaden yet dissipate into the 1,000 cults of the present New Age movement. And unless you're a total idiot, you can recognize a lot of the pathologies and the nightmares of what we've seen over the last 15 years with the fucking woke movement in precisely this. The most obvious example, I think, being the abysmal scenes from Glastonbury Festival last year, when you had these guys, Bob Vylan and Kneecap, running around with their Palestine flags chanting death to the IDF, and Bob Vylan doing his whole "I heard you want your country back, shut the fuck up," with these huge crowds of basically incredibly wealthy Londoners screaming in this cultic furore for them. 60 years to go from flower power and love and cows on the fields of Glastonbury to just celebrating Hamas and a violent Palestinian death cult with gang imagery, war imagery. It was insane, but it was the language Paglia, the horde. This was the horde. This is what the inheritors of the 60s counterculture today, rather, one of the ugly offshoots of them is the progressive horde. That's what we see. It's kind of funny when I was watching that, because this guy Bob Vylan, I used to go to a nightclub in London 10 years ago, kind of shitty rock nightclub. It wasn't the place where we usually hung out, but it was a place that was fueled with cocaine and narcissistic men picking up young women. I wasn't really into that, but there you go. And Bob Vylan often performed there with his band, and I just figured they were a bad Bob Dylan covers band, to be honest. I never saw them, and then here he is chanting death to the IDF, you can't have your I heard you want your country back, shut the fuck up, to a bunch of white people in a field, turning himself into some kind of primitive fetish god, like you see the Kneecap guys doing here down in the right as well. It's just, well, it's embarrassing, isn't it? But it's where we're at. And it was, the online right, I think everyone was just watching it and going, well, what's the whole line? When your enemy tell you who they are, believe them. That's what this is. This is what Paglia is pointing to. The naivety of the progressive ideals of the 60s, when not held by some kind of structure, turns into a horde. I mean, I suppose the other thing that she's not really getting at here, which I think is also important, is that the types of people at these festivals now, they are bureaucrats, they're government employees, they are teachers, they're people in NGOs and charities and supposedly progressive businesses. People are earning sort of upper middle class salaries, so they can afford to go and pay close to £1,000 in tickets and drink and drugs in a fucking field over the summer. So there is very little of the transcendental religious vision in them. There is perhaps something of the banal practicalities of legislation, administration, and financial accounting, but pushing it through from a place of dead materialism and then ending up worshipping their hordes. So this is the question that I keep coming back to and thinking about, is how to have some kind of revived, transcendentally oriented culture that is still capable of governance and administration and doesn't devolve into primitive rabble hordes? That is the $1 million question, I think, or the $1 trillion question. And in some sense, probably with my work, that's what I'm trying to figure out. As we draw to the end here. Cults multiply when institutional religion has lost fervour and become distracted by empty ritual. Early Christianity, for example, began as a rural rebellion against the fossilized temple bureaucracy in Jerusalem. In 1950s America, the political and professional elite was still heavily WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Prosperous congregations were overly concerned with social status at church or at its annex, the country club. Roman Catholicism, searching for social credibility, was steadily purging itself of immigrant working class ethnicity, a process of genteel self-Protestantization in music, ceremony and decor that in middle-class parishes is now virtually complete. Many of those attracted to cults in the 60s and early 70s were escaping mainline denominations where bland propriety was coupled with sexual repression. It is a striking fact that few young African Americans joined cults. Surely the reason was that the gospel tradition, rooted in the South, invited emotional and physical expressiveness, stimulated by strongly rhythmic music. Dance, universal in pagan cults, had been banned in Christian churches in late antiquity. Its presence in Southern church tradition is a priceless vestige of West African tribal religion. Now, this point is so interesting and probably requires its own video and its own right, and it's not something that I'm particularly expert on, not least because I'm not an American myself. So if any of you guys have any thoughts on this, any insight into this, do write in the comments. I'm curious. Pointing to this suggestion that actually the African spirituality or religion of America, the gospel churches, contains something of this pagan expressiveness. You could say that the Protestant religiosity missed, and therefore they actually didn't have the whole 1960s countercultural thing in the same way. Perhaps they provided a few icons like They provided a few icons like the Jimi Hendrixes, but in fact it was, in many senses, it's a white middle class movement. The 1960s, the counterculture. It's also interesting, of course, to look at what we saw on the previous slide with Bob Vylan, another black man preaching to a crowd of white middle class Brits. In some sense, there's a role that can be played, but it's not the audience. There's something there, and of course, look, in these images on the right hand side, we've got 1950s Protestant family compared with the more ecstatic black expression of culture, and the interaction of black and white culture has been it's defined much of pop culture. Perhaps it's fizzling out now, which is also interesting. I often think there's a line from AC/DC's Let There Be Rock where he says, white man had the chops, black man had the blues. And I like that, the chops being the skills and the technical mastery, of course. This sense that it was the fusion of this white Apollonian cultivation and black nigger intensity, you could say, that gave pop culture at its best, rock music at its best, Let There Be Rock, its particular intensity. Paglia would also say this Hindu transcendentalist religious vision at its best, rooted in sort of the darker sides of romanticism as well. These are many of the religious currents that we have moving through our Western religion of today. And then just a final slide, because I thought this is interesting, to the point about the Catholics becoming increasingly clean and Protestantized. There's no better example of that than looking at Mr. J.D. Vance doing his thing at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. I've made this point before. There's very little that's Catholic about the American National Catholic Prayer Breakfast if you've spent any time in southern Italy or Spain or even France. It's totally Protestant, Baptist, clean, Apollonian, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant. You've got Jordan Peterson doing his whole ARC thing as well, which, look, I've got time for a bit of Jordan, but it's so clean. And the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, yeah, it gives a cool name, ARC, but it's a terrible, terrible fucking name. On the right hand here, we've got some pictures of Brazil, or the Rio's carnival, something that Paglia loves. And while emphasizing that in Brazilian politics is perhaps nothing to imitate or admire, there is an interesting cultural synthesis in Brazil that combines Christianity and African paganism in something that is humongous. I mean, look how many people there are in these stands, and colourful and absurd and beautiful and erotic, while still being very rich and tasteful in some sense. Interview with, I believe, Tyler Cohen with Paglia a few years ago. He says, what does Brazilian culture have that North American culture lacks? What's the draw? She says, it's such a polyglot of cultures and ethnicities. But beyond that, Brazilians understood my work from the first moment I began to publish. Because what they understood was artifice, art, because of carnival for them, and costuming, masquerade, and all that Baroque exuberance and the syncretism of early Christianity with the Yoruba culture of West Africa in Salvador de Bahia. They understood my vision of art and beauty is an incredibly important human principle, rather than the way it was being trashed by my fellow feminists at that time. They also understand nature, the grandeur of nature, the power of nature. It's much larger. Now, can we expect something like the carnivals of Brazil in our near Western future? I don't know. I doubt it. I don't see us having the same infrastructure or even will to pull something like that off, at least materially. Would it be possible to have something like the exotic exuberance and visionary intensity of carnival in an internal spirituality and in small cults and ritual spaces and meditations and poetry and music? I think that could be much more likely. And we do see trends towards it. There are flavors of interesting syntheses. I think, for example, my friend Daniel Cadwallath, who makes music as Arc du Soleil, he's got this kind of indie psychedelic cafe rock sound, but influenced by Indian raga music. You can hear it if you know you're listening to it. It's subtle, but it's there. And his ethnically is Sri Lankan, and it comes through. He's made that a point of influence. I'm fascinated by flamenco music at the moment. The music of the deep Spanish South and the gypsy communities, which is again all about dance and the intense passion, the duende of performance, rather than the clear, perfect recording. Nick Cave, the Australian musician, has also written about duende, and we'll probably do a video about it in future, about this like dark, black, bloody, rooted passion that comes through in the best performances. And I do think in this world of AI, the hype around AI creativity, I actually think the only real future for the arts is to turn away from this clean beauty towards this exuberant, visionary, romantic darkness, you might say. So that's that. And these are the strains that, as I said, have been beneath the surface in American culture, which has become global culture for a long time, going back to at least the mid-1750s, if not long before, with the Puritans, both this strict Protestant, but with a fiery, bloody imagination, and this earthy, natural, woodsy, neo-primitivism. Not to mention, of course, the influence of the blacks and the Aruba spiritualities and other gods that come over on the boats and are poorly understood, and indeed the Native Americans too. These are things that Paglia is interested in, and that is all under the surface of what is manifesting in the world today. The question is, what can we do creatively with it? Because it's abundantly clear that our pop culture, our Hollywood, our pop music is dog shit, dead, corrupted, not worth shit. So let me know what you think, and also, as I mentioned, go check out our website if you're interested in talking to us or working together. We've put on some pretty interesting performances and live rituals and retreats, and also working with some of the most interesting artists and philosophers in the world at the moment. So if that's interesting to you, do go and have a look. See you on the other side.